Hello, Dr. Cooper here again. Today we had four interesting readings. Two looking at some of the bigger concepts that have occurred in recent years. Well, I was looking, one of them is actually 1991, which is by nobody's stretched the imagination recent, but trends that have had influence recently, and a couple of articles about why people teach world history and trying to make sense of how you put the big theories together with a classroom approach. Okay, so starting with Melish's work on global history, and very many people use the terms global history and world history interchangeably, and there's nothing much wrong with that, except there is a distinction has been drawn in the profession, and it's a distinction you should know about and be careful of this terminology. We talked a little bit in my last lecture about terminology and how that unpacking that terminology has become incredibly important to the world history debate. So Melish argues that world history is the history of the whole history of the whole world, trying to incorporate that gamut. And he does a little bit of a job trying to talk about some of the major players, some of which you'll already been aware of from yesterday's wiki assignment. And global history, by contrast, he talks about as the history of the global age, the age of globality, he says. I don't really like that term, but globalization. So he points to some distinct global trends that have come about from the Earth first being seen from space in the 1960s, to satellites that have put us in contact with each other, nuclear threats, and the threat of nuclear catastrophe, which certainly goes beyond national borders, and other invasions that are beyond the scope of territorial states, for instance, diseases, environmental problems, which again are beyond the ability to tackle purely on the nation-state basis, and of course multinational corporations, some of which have a larger gross domestic product than some small countries. He sees what he calls a new global epoch beginning in the 1970s. Important date, important term, epoch. I'm always a little wary when people not too far into an epoch-making process begin to talk about that epoch as such. And there's this, like, whether what we're looking at is the start of a long globalization process, which some people would argue began, in the ancient world, or something that really radically new that happened, as Malish argues, in the 1970s. And he argues that in this way, time and space were compressed in unprecedented ways. The amount of time it takes to get to communicate, for example, is certainly been compressed in a very unprecedented way. I remember, as a young woman myself, going to Poland, and it took an hour and a half to get a phone call put through to my mother in England, and I had to go to a post office, like a post office exchange, to have this call put through. And I'm not that old. This wasn't in the 60s or anything like that. This was in the I want to say like 1991, 1992 or something like that. So it's not that far long ago, where I had to have a call put through like that. So there are some things about this. There's something about Maslish's article which I can't quite put my finger on. That's always made me quite uncomfortable, though. And I think it seems a little final, that globalization is happening, and it's done. I think this was written in 98, which is before 2001, and I think maybe some of that rhetoric might be a bit different, as we see not the globe coming together, but the globe fracturing along new lines at the same time. Anyway, moving on to Christian's theory of big history. So whereas we talked about time and space quite a lot. Christian's theory is that world history should involve the whole of time as well as the whole of space. So it's not a history just of humans, but also of the planet, of our solar system, of the universe. Of course, Christians' ideas are inherently interdisciplinary. We struggle to get out of our little historical niches. I'm a historian of actually 11th century English monasticism, and that's a very, very small niche. But in order to get into big history, you also have to be aware of astronomy, physics, biology, geology, etc. And his idea is that instead of these little tiny slivers of history that we all expertise in, what we need to create is a large-scale map of the past. And one thing I like that Christian expresses in this article is that facts don't speak for themselves. Historians are required to give historical facts a voice, and this is that's certainly true. And he talks about some of the criticisms of his big history theory, the lack of detail, and lack of expertise. So firstly, he argues that detail is relative. The amount of detail you need depends on the questions being asked. And if you're asking questions in too much detail, maybe you're missing the bigger questions, the larger questions. And expertise, well, we can't all be historians of everywhere. We can't have the language abilities to do that, for one thing. But in other fields, particularly like science, it's very common to stray beyond your own field of endeavour and to poach work from other fields of intellectual endeavour to inform what you're doing. So in general, Christian's idea is big history is a search for larger meaning, what it means to be a human on the planet Earth, in the solar system, in this universe. And it certainly has a place, and it has its advocates, including Bill Gates, who's a big fan of big history. So now we're on to our two pedagogical articles. And Everdell's approach, I think, really can be summed up by the word student-centered. He's very clear about starting where the students are at. Sometimes I think he might be a little bit dismissive of the general interest of students, but then again, I teach at college, not at high school, so I might stand corrected by the high school history teachers here. And he talks about reducing self-regard, the idea of, the student as an island and everything revolves around them, and reducing this by trying to introduce them to the idea that they are citizens of a wider world, with patience and with a need to back up and explain things. I love the way he talks about challenging hitherto unchallenged preconceptions. This is certainly something I've come across, where students tell me categorically that they know things to be true when they are not actually true. And that can be factual things like, farming started in one place, it started in the Fertile Crescent. What am I talking about? It also had an origin in New Guinea. I must be mad. Their high school history teacher never told them that, etc., etc. So there's a lot of preconceptions. They just don't even know where they got them from. They just think that for no particular reason. Okay, so he talks about thinking in 3 dimensions in terms of periods, different periods. He divides it into 6 different regions. I think these divides into 8, and different themes. And he comes up with the acronym Persia. Sorry, I'm just going to have to look this up because I've forgotten what it means right now. The acronym Persia, which is political. Oh, lost it. There we go, Persia, sorry. Political, economic, religious, social and gender, intellectual, artistic, and the Persia T is technology on the end of that. Sorry about that. And then he comes up with this, what I think is a horrendous figure of 330 slots by sort of timing periods, by regions, by themes. Well, yes, that is sort of the outline plan of what you could talk about. But as we were just talking with the previous article we were talking about, your job is to give voice to the facts, to create a narrative that's understandable, and trying to fit 330 slots is a little weird, I think, but I get what he means. And he also says, the old perennial political history appeals to boys and social history to girls. Yes, it's a generalization. Yes, it's a generalization that's generally true. But challenge that. Both boys like social history, girls like political history, as long as they're not presented in a dry way. And he also talks about not presenting history as a fait accompli. This happened because it was inevitable that was going to happen, and we just got to learn, the stages on the way of it happening. It's very important to talk about contingency or luck, blind luck sometimes in the outcome of historical events. And a word that I might have made up, uninevitability. There's no inevitable. It wasn't inevitable, for example, that there was going to be World War One. A lot of people say that. Nothing's inevitable until it's actually happened, I guess. And he also stresses the importance of debate, having students engage with these topics directly and talk about them as if they're present and real, and there's something, not something that can be done about them initially, but something that can be said about them that's relevant. Okay, and lastly, Dorman, who has this very short essay about why teach world history. And he has some good ideas in here, I think. The idea that, world history is about looking at what different areas of the world approaching the same fundamental questions at the same time, or the same time frame period. And this, I think, is very important to my understanding of world history. And we talk a lot about connections and societies in contact, but there's also these things that are happening in societies that aren't directly in contact, but things happen, farming for one, philosophical ideas, religious ideas seem to occur at similar time periods without societies necessarily being in contact and directly influencing each other, and that's important to study as well. And he talks about a world that's been flattened and globalized. In many ways this is true, taking on from what Malish was saying. And the need to create an interconnected historical narrative. And this is something I want to stress again and again. In some ways, what you create in a world history class is your story, your way of making sense of all this, of putting it all together, drawing those connections, of helping your students draw those connections. If you just present 330 slots that divide period, period, region, and theme, then you're just going to be confusing your students and confusing yourself. He talks very importantly about the skills and the habits of mind, and we're going to talk a bit more about this later in the course. How important is it, amongst all this content, to also impart to your students habits of mind, skills, analysis, writing, those kinds of things, which you need to be able to make sense of such a morass of material. He talks a little bit about textbooks and supplementary materials, but again, he kind of thinks about it, I think, the same way as I do. That is secondary to having your own clear navigable path through the material. And what I like about this article is that he sets as a goal the students be able to make sense of the contemporary world events in a global historical context. And it's very important that you do spend some time sitting down and thinking, what do I want my students to get out of this? And one of the questions I have further along the line is, what do you want students to remember in 6 months, 6 years, 16 years, etc.? What are your goals? And in some way, that's a good way to start to plan your classes, rather than start to think about, oh my God, how do I fit all this in? So dare to omit, again, that mantra, dare to omit, and put in only what helps tell your interconnected historical narrative. So things to think about: time versus space, the idea of being a mile deep and an inch wide versus I think I just put the same thing again there. Okay, ignore what it says on the screen. A mile deep and an inch wide versus an inch deep and a mile wide. Those are two sort of contrasting ways of looking at how you should do history. And grand organizing principles, levels of student interest. But most importantly, remember, this is your course, your narrative, your connection, and your voice given to the facts. Okay, thank you.